The crack of a gavel cut through the somber silence of the Ukiah courthouse like a whip on a hot summer day, each strike hammering another nail into Grace Cooper's heart. Blood drained from her face as Sheriff Tanner's voice pronounced the words she had dreaded for months. Sold. The Cooper Ranch and all its holdings to Mr. Yates Dawson for the sum of $2,300. California, 1878. 3 months after burying her husband beneath the old oak tree that had shaded their home for 12 years, Grace stood frozen as strangers decided the fate of everything she had left in the world. Her trembling hands clutched the worn leather of her husband's journal, the only possession she'd been permitted to keep. "This can't be happening," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. At 32, she never imagined she would lose her husband Thomas to a stray bullet from a drunken cowhand, much less lose her home to the debts he'd hidden from her. The crowd began to disperse, leaving Grace standing alone in the aisle, unable to move, unable to process that by nightfall she would be homeless. Mayor Brewster avoided her gaze as he shuffled past. Even Mrs. Hopkins, who had taken meals with them after church every Sunday for years, hurried by with only a sympathetic pat on the arm. "Madam." The deep voice startled Grace from her daze. A tall man stood before her, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his hat. Yates Dawson. She recognized him vaguely as a rancher who'd moved to the area about a year back. He'd purchased the old Wellington place east of town and kept mostly to himself. "I believe this is yours now," Grace said bitterly, pulling her wedding band from her finger and extending it. "It's the only thing of value I have left." Yates Dawson's weathered hand closed over hers, gently pushing the ring back. "Keep it," he said, his voice low and steady. "I didn't come for your jewelry, Mrs. Cooper." "Then what more could you possibly want?" Grace asked, unable to mask the tremor in her voice. "You've taken everything else." Something flickered in his eyes, not the triumph she expected to see in the face of the man who had just purchased her life's work for pennies on the dollar, but something deeper, more complex. "I came to give you this," he said, extending an envelope. Grace took it reluctantly, her fingers brushing against his calloused ones. Opening it, she found the deed to her ranch inside, her name still printed in fading ink beneath the newer, bolder signature of Yates Dawson. "I don't understand." Her eyes searched his face for any sign of mockery. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "We rebuild together." Grace blinked, certain she had misheard him. "Pardon me." "The bank may have forced the sale, but no one said anything about who gets to live there." He straightened his back, standing tall enough that the sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows caught the flecks of gold in his otherwise deep brown eyes. "I've got a wagon outside. I figure you'll want to head back to the ranch before nightfall." "Why would you do this?" Grace asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. In her experience, men didn't help women without expecting something in return. "My reasons are my own," he replied, adjusting his hat. "But I give you my word, Mrs. Cooper, your virtue isn't part of the bargain." Grace's cheeks flushed hot with indignation. "I never suggested—" "Folks will talk," he interrupted, nodding toward the courthouse windows where several townspeople lingered, watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Let them. I've got thick skin and I reckon you do too." He turned toward the door, pausing when she didn't follow. "Coming." Grace clutched the deed to her chest, mind racing. She had nowhere else to go, no family to take her in. The alternatives becoming a laundress, a maid, or worse flashed before her eyes. "I suppose I am," she finally answered, gathering her skirts and following him out into the harsh California sunlight. The wagon ride back to the ranch was conducted in silence. the creaking of the wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses providing a rhythmic backdrop to Grace's tumultuous thoughts. She stole glances at the stranger beside her, this man who now owned her home but was, for reasons she couldn't fathom, offering to share it with her. Yates Dawson kept his eyes on the road ahead, his profile strong against the backdrop of golden hills and scattered oak trees. His hands, holding the reins with casual confidence, bore the calluses of hard work. Not the soft hands of a banker or a lawyer, but the hands of a man who knew the land. As they crested the hill that overlooked the Cooper ranch, Grace felt her heart constrict. The once proud homestead looked tired now, with its peeling paint and sagging fence posts. The barn roof had started to leak during the spring rains, and the corral gate hung crooked on its hinges. Thomas had been neglecting repairs for longer than she'd realized, choosing instead to spend his days in town, apparently accruing the debt that had finally claimed their home. "It needs work," Yates observed, breaking the silence. "It wasn't always like this," Grace said defensively. "Before Thomas, before he started having troubles." Yates nodded without comment, guiding the wagon down the rutted path toward the house. When they reached the yard, he set the brake and jumped down, coming around to offer his hand. Grace hesitated only a moment before accepting it, feeling the strength in his fingers as he helped her down. "I'll get my things from the barn loft," he said, releasing her hand. "I figure you'll want the house to yourself." "The loft," Grace frowned. "But the house has 3 bedrooms." "A man who moves into a widow's house and takes a bedroom is asking for trouble," Yates said matter-of-factly. "I've no interest in ruining your reputation any further than it already might be." Grace watched as he unloaded his belongings, a modest collection contained in 2 leather trunks and a bedroll. No fancy clothes or unnecessary luxuries, just the essentials of a working man. "Mr. Dawson," she called as he headed toward the barn. He turned, squinting against the late afternoon sun. "Why did you really buy this place?" she asked, the question that had been burning inside her since the courthouse finally escaping her lips. Something resembling a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Get some rest, Mrs. Cooper. We start work at dawn." With that, he disappeared into the barn, leaving Grace standing in the yard of the home that was no longer hers, yet somehow still was. That night, Grace barely slept, her mind racing with questions about her strange new arrangement. From her bedroom window, she could see the light of a lantern glowing in the barn loft until well past midnight. What was this man planning? And why had he chosen her ranch of all places to invest his money? Dawn broke with the sound of hammering. Grace dressed quickly and made her way outside to find Yates already at work, replacing the broken boards on the front porch steps. He'd laid out tools in neat rows and had a pile of fresh-cut lumber stacked nearby. "Good morning," she said, suddenly self-conscious in her simple work dress and hastily pinned hair. Yates looked up, wiping sweat from his brow despite the early hour. "Mrs. Cooper, hope I didn't wake you." "Not at all. I'm usually up with the sun." She gestured toward the house. "I was about to make breakfast. Would you care to join me?" He considered for a moment, then nodded. "That would be welcome. Just let me finish this step first." Grace returned to the kitchen, grateful for the familiar routine of cooking. She built up the fire in the stove and mixed biscuit dough, her hands working from memory while her mind puzzled over her new arrangement. By the time Yates entered through the back door, removing his hat respectfully, she had coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in the cast iron pan. "Smells good," he said, taking a seat at the kitchen table only after she gestured for him to do so. "Been a while since I've had a home-cooked meal." "Do you live alone at your ranch?" Grace asked, sliding the biscuits into the oven. "I do. Came west from Texas about 5 years ago. Worked cattle drives until I saved enough to buy my own place. The Wellington Ranch, Grace nodded, pouring him coffee. It's good land. It is, though not as good as this, he admitted, looking around. You've got better water access here, and the soil in your south field would grow just about anything. Grace brought plates to the table and sat across from him. You seem to know a lot about my ranch. Yates took a sip of his coffee before answering. I make it my business to know the land around me. Good neighbors depend on it. We're neighbors now. I thought you owned this place. The paper says I do, he acknowledged. But paper doesn't mean much out here, does it? It's the work that makes a place yours. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Grace gathered her courage to ask, "What did you mean yesterday? About rebuilding together?" Yates set down his fork and looked at her directly. "Your husband left this place in bad shape, Mrs. Cooper, and not just the buildings. The bank told me he mortgaged it to cover gambling debts." Grace flinched at his bluntness. "I didn't know until after he died. He kept that from me." "I figured as much," Yates nodded. "You don't strike me as the type to let things fall apart if you could help it." "I'm not," she said firmly. "I worked alongside Thomas building this ranch from nothing. I can work it alone if I have to." "No doubt you could," he agreed, surprising her. "But you don't have to. I'm proposing a partnership. I've got the deed, you've got the knowledge of this specific land. Together, we can make this place profitable again. And then what? You sell it out from under me once it's valuable." A flash of something hurt, perhaps, crossed his face before his expression settled back into its usual reserve. "No, madam. Then we both benefit from the success." "Why should I trust you?" Grace asked plainly. Yates held her gaze. "You shouldn't. Not yet. Trust is earned, but I'm asking for a chance to earn it." There was an earnestness in his eyes that made Grace want to believe him. Still, she had been fooled before, not just by Thomas's secret gambling, but by his promises that things would get better, that next season would bring the change they needed. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked cautiously. "We work the ranch together for 1 year," he said. "If at the end of that time you want me gone, I'll sign the deed back over to you at a fair price that we agree on now, paid in installments from the ranch profits." Grace's breath caught. "You would do that?" "I would, in writing." "And if I don't want you gone?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we renegotiate based on where we stand." It was a better offer than she had any right to expect, yet suspicion still nagged at her. Most men wouldn't be so generous. "I'm not most men," he said simply, rising from the table. "Think it over. I'll be fixing that barn roof today if you need me." As he reached the door, Grace called out, "Mr. Dawson." He turned, hat already in hand. "I accept your proposal," she said. 1 year. He nodded once, a solemn acknowledgment of their agreement. 1 year. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as familiar as the seasons themselves. Grace rose before dawn to prepare breakfast while Yates tended to the morning chores. They would eat together, discussing the day's tasks before setting off to their respective duties. To Grace's surprise, Yates never questioned her knowledge of ranching or attempted to override her decisions about the land. Instead, he listened carefully when she explained which fields drained poorly during the rainy season, or which section of fence the neighbor's bull had repeatedly tested. "Thomas always said I fussed too much over the details," Grace admitted one evening as they sat on the newly repaired porch steps, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson. "Details matter," Yates replied, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. "Especially on a ranch this size. Miss one loose board and you could lose a whole herd come stampede time." Grace smiled faintly. "That's what I tried to tell him." Some men have a hard time listening to wisdom when it comes from a woman, Yates observed, his knife pausing in its work. Their loss. A comfortable silence settled between them as the light faded from the sky. In the month since Yates had bought the ranch, they had repaired the barn roof, mended the fences, and cleaned out the irrigation ditches. The house still needed work. The roof leaked in 2 places, and the back porch was practically falling off, but the essential repairs to make the ranch functional again had been completed. "I never thanked you properly," Grace said suddenly, "for what you did at the auction." Yates's hands resumed their careful work on the wood. "No need for thanks. It was a business decision." "Was it?" Grace turned to look at him, studying his profile in the fading light. "Most business decisions don't involve letting someone else live in your investment for free." He was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "When I first came to Ukiah, your husband helped me find my footing, showed me which merchants were fair and which would cheat a newcomer, introduced me around." "That sounds like Thomas," Grace nodded. "He was always friendly to strangers. He mentioned you often," Yates continued. "Said his wife was the backbone of their ranch, that without you he'd have nothing." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "He said that, he did." Yates examined the piece he was carving. A small wooden horse was taking shape. "When I heard about his passing, and then about the auction, well, it didn't seem right that his widow should lose everything because of his mistakes." "So it was a debt of honor," Grace said softly, understanding dawning. "Something like that." Yates stood, brushing wood shavings from his pants. "Though I hope you don't mind me saying, the more time I spend here, the more I think I got the better end of the deal. This land has potential, Mrs. Cooper, real potential, Grace," she said impulsively. "If we're to be partners for a year, you might as well call me Grace." He looked down at her, surprise evident in his usually composed expression. "Grace," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. "Then I suppose you should call me Yates." "Yates," she nodded, a strange fluttering sensation in her chest as their eyes met. He cleared his throat and handed her the wooden horse. "It's not much, but I thought you might like it." Grace accepted the carving, running her fingers over the smooth lines of the miniature horse. It was beautifully crafted, with careful attention to the flowing mane and muscular legs. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "Thank you." Yates nodded once, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Yates." As she watched him walk toward the barn, Grace realized that for the first time since Thomas's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The summer heat settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, making even the simplest tasks twice as demanding. Grace and Yates worked from first light until dusk, stopping only when the temperature became unbearable in the middle of the day. On one particularly sweltering afternoon, Grace found Yates by the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. He had removed his shirt and was splashing water over his head and torso in an attempt to cool down. She stopped short, embarrassed to have intruded on his privacy, but not before noticing the web of scars that crossed his back. "I'm sorry," she said, turning to leave. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "It's all right," Yates said, quickly pulling his shirt back on despite it sticking to his damp skin. "Did you need something?" Grace hesitated, then held up the jug she'd brought. "Fresh lemonade. I thought you might be thirsty." "That's mighty thoughtful, thank you." He accepted the jug gratefully, taking a long drink. Grace found herself glancing at his back, wondering about the scars but knowing better than to ask. Some stories weren't meant to be shared. "I've been thinking," Yates said, breaking into her thoughts. "We should consider planting some fruit trees along this creek. The soil's good and they'd have plenty of water. In a few years, we could be selling apples and pears alongside the cattle." "We," Grace raised an eyebrow. You're thinking beyond our 1-year agreement, Mr. Dawson. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I thought we were on first-name terms now. Yates, she corrected herself, returning his smile. And yes, fruit trees would do well here. Thomas and I discussed it once, but he was always focused on the cattle. Cattle are important, Yates nodded, but diversification provides security. Bad years for one crop might be good for another. Grace found herself nodding along. My father used to say something similar. He had a small farm in Oregon before the fever took him and my mother. I'm sorry to hear that, Yates said, genuine sympathy in his voice. How did you end up in California? My aunt brought me here after they died. I was 16. She worked as a housekeeper for the Tanner family, the sheriff's parents. That's how I met Thomas. He was working as a ranch hand for their neighbors. Yates handed back the lemonade jug. Love at first sight, Grace laughed softly. Hardly. I thought he was too full of himself, but he was persistent. Showed up at the Tanners every Sunday for dinner until I agreed to let him court me. Sounds like a determined man. He was, Grace agreed, her smile fading slightly. When he set his mind to something, there was no stopping him. I just never realized he'd set his mind to gambling too. Yates was quiet for a moment. We all have our demons, I suppose. What are yours? Grace asked boldly, surprising herself with her directness. He looked at her with something like admiration in his eyes. Direct, aren't you? Life's too short for anything else. Fair enough. He leaned against a nearby tree, considering his words. I fought for the Confederacy. Not because I believed in their cause, I didn't own slaves and never wanted to, but because Texas was my home, and that's where my loyalty lay. Grace nodded, understanding the complexity of those divided loyalties during the war. After Appomattox, I couldn't go home, he continued. Too many ghosts, so I drifted west, worked cattle drives, took odd jobs. The demons. They follow you no matter how far you run. The scars on your back, Grace said quietly. From the war, he shook his head. Prison camp, Andersonville, I was captured in '64. Grace had heard stories about the notorious Confederate prison camp, where thousands of Union soldiers had died from disease, exposure, and starvation. I'm sorry, she said simply, knowing no words could address such suffering. Yates shrugged, his expression closing off. It was a long time ago. Not so long, Grace said gently. 13 years isn't enough to forget something like that. No, he agreed, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. But it's long enough to learn to live with it. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Grace couldn't or wouldn't name. I should get back to the house, she said finally, breaking the spell. I've got bread in the oven. Yates straightened, clearing his throat, and I need to finish clearing this section of brush. Thank you for the lemonade. As Grace walked back to the house, she found herself thinking about the man who had unexpectedly become such an integral part of her daily life. There was more to Yates Dawson than met the eye, more pain, more depth, more complexity. And more danger, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind. Danger not to her physical safety, but to the careful walls she had built around her heart since Thomas's death. The summer melted into fall, bringing cooler temperatures and new tasks to prepare the ranch for winter. Grace and Yates settled into a comfortable partnership, each respecting the other's strengths and compensating for their weaknesses without discussion or fanfare. Word had spread through Ukiah about their unusual arrangement, and while some tongues wagged with speculation, most of the townsfolk seemed to accept that Yates Dawson had simply done a kindness for a widow in need. Still, Grace noticed the curious glances when they rode into town together for supplies, and the way conversations sometimes halted when they entered the general store. Pay them no mind, Yates advised when Grace mentioned the gossip. People will talk regardless of what we do. "It doesn't bother you?" Grace asked as they loaded sacks of flour and sugar into their wagon. What they might be saying, should it? He secured the last of their purchases and offered his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. "We know the truth of our arrangement, that's what matters." But what was the truth? Grace wondered as they headed back to the ranch. Their business partnership had gradually evolved into something that felt like friendship. They shared meals, ideas, occasional laughter, and more frequently comfortable silences that needed no filling. At night, Grace would sometimes stand at her bedroom window and watch the light in the barn loft, knowing Yates was probably reading or carving by lamplight. She tried not to think about how empty the house felt despite his presence on the property, or how she sometimes caught herself listening for his footsteps on the porch when he came in for meals. As they approached the ranch, Grace noticed smoke rising from beyond the northern ridge, not the controlled burn of a neighbor clearing fields, but the thick, dark plume of a structure fire. "Yates, look," she pointed toward the smoke. He followed her gaze, his expression immediately shifting to concern. "That's the Richardson place." Without discussion, he snapped the reins, urging the horses into a gallop toward the neighboring ranch. As they crested the ridge, they saw the Richardson barn fully engulfed in flames, with several men frantically forming a bucket brigade from the nearby well. Yates brought their wagon to a halt and jumped down. "Stay here," he told Grace before running toward the chaos. Grace ignored his instruction, following closely behind. "I can help too." Old Mr. Richardson spotted them and hurried over, his face smudged with soot. "Dawson, thank God. We need more hands, the horses are still inside." Without hesitation, Yates sprinted toward the burning barn, disappearing into the smoke-filled doorway before Grace could call out a warning. "Yates!" she cried, starting after him only to be held back by Mr. Richardson. "Don't, Mrs. Cooper. It's too dangerous." Agonizing minutes passed as the men continued passing buckets, trying to contain the fire from spreading to the nearby house. Grace's eyes remained fixed on the barn entrance, her heart pounding with fear. Just when she thought he couldn't possibly survive, Yates emerged from the smoke, leading two terrified horses. He handed their reins to a ranch hand and turned back toward the building. "There's one more," he shouted before disappearing again into the inferno. This time, the wait seemed even longer. The roof of the barn began to collapse in sections, sending showers of sparks into the air. Grace found herself praying desperately, something she hadn't done since Thomas's funeral. When Yates finally staggered out, half carrying a badly burned horse, the relief that flooded through Grace nearly brought her to her knees. His face and clothes were blackened with soot, and he was coughing violently, but he was alive. She rushed to his side as he guided the injured horse to safety, catching him as he stumbled. "You foolish, brave man," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You could have been killed." Yates looked down at her, his eyes startlingly clear against his smoke-darkened face. "Couldn't leave them to burn," he rasped. Grace helped him to a nearby water trough where he could wash the soot from his face and hands. His shirt was singed in places, and an angry red burn marked his forearm where embers had fallen. "Let me see that," she insisted, gently examining his injury. "It's nothing." He tried to dismiss it, but winced when she touched the burned skin. "It's not nothing. We need to get you home and treat this properly." Mrs. Richardson approached with a clean cloth soaked in cool water. "Here, Mrs. Cooper, for his burn. And there's some salve in the house if you need it." "Thank you," Grace said, carefully wrapping Yates's arm. "I'm sorry about your barn." "Buildings can be replaced," the older woman said, watching as her husband examined the injured horse. "Lives can't. Your man saved our breeding stock. We owe him a debt we can't repay." "Your man." Grace didn't correct her. too focused on tending to Yates's injury. By the time they returned to their own ranch, the sun was setting and Yates was clearly exhausted. His coughing had subsided somewhat, but the burn on his arm looked painful despite Mrs. Richardson's salve. "You're sleeping in the house tonight," Grace informed him as she helped him down from the wagon. "I won't have you climbing up to that loft with your arm like this." For once, Yates didn't argue. He followed her inside, sinking gratefully into a kitchen chair while she prepared a basin of clean water and fresh bandages. "Shirt off," she instructed, her tone brooking no argument. "I need to make sure you don't have other burns we missed." Yates hesitated only briefly before complying, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured arm. In the lamp light, Grace could see the full extent of the scars on his back, long, cruel marks that could only have been made by repeated whippings. She kept her expression neutral, focusing instead on checking him for new injuries. "I think your arm got the worst of it," she said after a thorough examination. "But your lungs took in a lot of smoke. You'll need to rest for a few days." "Can't afford to rest," he protested weakly. "The north pasture fencing will wait," Grace finished firmly. "You're no good to this ranch if you work yourself to death." As she cleaned and rebandaged his burn, Grace was acutely aware of his proximity, of the steady rise and fall of his bare chest, of the way his eyes followed her movements. When her fingers accidentally brushed against his uninjured skin, she felt him tense slightly. "Sorry," she murmured. "Did I hurt you?" "No," he said, his voice low. "Not at all." Grace secured the bandage and stepped back, suddenly self-conscious. "You can take the spare bedroom. The sheets are clean, and there's extra blankets in the trunk if you get cold." Yates nodded, reaching for his ruined shirt only to have Grace stop him. "I'll find you one of Thomas's old shirts," she said, hurrying to her bedroom before he could respond. In the privacy of her room, Grace took a moment to collect herself, pressing her hands to her flushed cheeks. What was wrong with her? She was acting like a schoolgirl, not a grown woman and widow of 32. When she returned with a clean shirt, Yates had moved to stand by the window, looking out at the darkened ranch. The lamplight traced the contours of his shoulders and the sharp line of his jaw, and Grace found herself pausing in the doorway, struck by the realization that Yates Dawson was a handsome man, something she had deliberately avoided acknowledging for months. "Here," she said, breaking the silence. "It might be a bit small across the shoulders, but it's better than nothing." Yates turned and accepted the shirt with a nod of thanks. "I appreciate all your help today." "You would have done the same for me," Grace said simply. "Yes," he agreed, his gaze holding hers. "I would have." That night, lying in her bed with the knowledge that Yates was just down the hall instead of in the distant barn loft, Grace faced the truth she had been avoiding. She was developing feelings for her business partner. Feelings that complicated their arrangement and threatened the careful balance they had established. Worse, she had no idea if those feelings were reciprocated. Yates treated her with respect and kindness, but he maintained a careful distance that she had initially appreciated but now found frustrating. Was he simply honoring their agreement, or did he not see her as a woman he could care for? Sleep eluded her as she turned these questions over in her mind, listening to the occasional creak of floorboards as Yates moved about in the spare room. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, but her dreams were filled with fire, smoke, and the terrifying image of Yates disappearing into flames. She awoke at dawn, momentarily disoriented by the sound of coughing nearby. Then she remembered Yates was in the house. Grace quickly dressed and made her way to the kitchen, finding him already there, attempting to build a fire in the stove despite his injured arm. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, rushing forward to take the kindling from his hands. "Making coffee," he replied, his voice rough from smoke and coughing. Figured it was the least I could do after you played nursemaid yesterday. You're supposed to be resting, Grace scolded, though she couldn't help but smile at his stubborn independence, a trait they shared. I've rested, he insisted, then undermined his claim with a bout of coughing that had him gripping the edge of the table for support. Grace guided him to a chair. Sit. I'll make breakfast and then you're going back to bed. Dr. Palmer can come out from town to check your lungs. We don't need to bother the doctor, Yates protested. It's just a bit of smoke. A bit of smoke can kill a man if it's bad enough, Grace countered, busying herself with the stove. My mind's made up. I'm riding into town after breakfast to fetch him. Yates watched her work, a bemused expression on his face. You're a stubborn woman, Grace Cooper. So I've been told, she replied, cracking eggs into a bowl. Usually right before someone realizes I'm right. A chuckle escaped him, quickly turning into another cough. I'm beginning to see that pattern myself. While Grace prepared breakfast, Yates told her about his plans for the north pasture, how they could extend the grazing area by clearing some of the brush and building new fencing to encompass the natural spring there. It would give us capacity for at least 20 more head, he explained, his face animated despite his exhaustion. And with beef prices rising, that could mean significant profit next year. Grace set a plate of eggs and bacon before him, noting his use of us, and we when discussing the ranch's future. You speak as if you're planning to stay beyond our agreement. Yates paused, fork halfway to his mouth. Force of habit, I suppose. But I won't deny I've grown attached to this place. His eyes met hers briefly before returning to his plate, and the people on it. Grace felt her cheeks warm at the implied compliment. I've grown accustomed to having you around too, she admitted. Even if you do take foolish risks running into burning buildings. Some things are worth the risk, Yates said quietly, and Grace had the distinct impression they were no longer talking about the Richardson horses. After breakfast, she insisted on checking his bandages before heading into town. The burn looked angry but clean, with no signs of infection. As she rewrapped it, her fingers lingered perhaps longer than necessary on his skin. You have gentle hands, Yates observed, his voice low. Grace looked up to find his face closer than she expected, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. My mother was a healer, she explained, forcing herself to focus on the bandage. She taught me a little before she passed. She taught you well. When Grace finished, she reluctantly stepped back, breaking the strange tension that had built between them. I should go. The sooner I fetch Dr. Palmer, the sooner we'll know if your lungs are all right. Yates nodded but caught her hand as she turned to leave. Grace. She looked back, surprised by the contact. Thank you, he said simply. For caring. Grace squeezed his hand before gently extracting hers. Rest while I'm gone. That's an order. His smile followed her out the door and stayed with her all the way to town. Dr. Palmer confirmed what Grace had feared. Yates had indeed damaged his lungs with smoke inhalation, though not severely enough to cause permanent harm if he allowed himself proper time to recover. Bed rest for at least 3 days, the doctor instructed, packing away his stethoscope. And no heavy labor for at least 2 weeks after that. The body needs time to clear the lungs. He won't like that, Grace sighed. Few men do, Dr. Palmer agreed with a knowing smile. But I suspect he'll listen to you, Mrs. Cooper. He seems to value your opinion. Does he? Grace asked, genuinely surprised. My dear, that man hasn't taken his eyes off you since I arrived, the doctor said kindly. And it's not because he fears my diagnosis. Grace glanced over to where Yates sat on the porch, looking out over the fields with obvious restlessness. You're mistaken, doctor. We have a business arrangement, nothing more. If you say so, he replied, clearly unconvinced. But in my 40 years of practice, I've learned to recognize certain symptoms. And Mr. Dawson shows all the signs of a man who's fallen hard for a woman he respects too much to pursue. Before Grace could formulate a response, the doctor tipped his hat and headed toward his waiting buggy, leaving her to contemplate his words. The prescribed rest period was difficult for both of them. Yates chafed at the inactivity, while Grace found herself overwhelmed trying to manage the ranch alone while also caring for her patient. By the third day, they were both irritable from the strain. "This is ridiculous," Yates declared, throwing aside the book he'd been attempting to read. "I'm perfectly capable of at least supervising the work on the north fence." "Supervising means standing in the sun for hours," Grace countered, not looking up from the mending in her lap. "Which doctor?" "Palmer specifically prohibited." "The man's a tyrant," Yates muttered, then immediately looked contrite when Grace raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry. I know you're working twice as hard because of me. I just feel so useless sitting here." Grace set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the porch swing. "You're not useless. You're healing. There's a difference." "Doesn't feel like it," he sighed, leaning back and closing his eyes. "I've never been good at sitting still." "I've noticed," Grace smiled. "You remind me of my father that way. He used to say idle hands were the devil's workshop." "Wise man," Yates nodded. "What was he like?" "Your father," Grace considered the question, memories flooding back of the tall, kind man who had taught her to ride and shoot and think for herself. "He was strong but gentle, never raised his voice, never needed to. When he spoke, people listened because they knew his words had weight." "Sounds like someone else I know," Yates said, opening his eyes to look at her. Grace felt herself blush under his steady gaze. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said you could judge a man by how he treated animals and those weaker than himself." "High praise, considering you saw me run into a burning barn for horses," Yates smiled. "Exactly my point," Grace nodded, "though I'm still not convinced that was wise." "Wisdom and courage don't always walk hand in hand," Yates admitted, "but I couldn't stand by and watch those animals suffer." They fell into a comfortable silence, the porch swing creaking gently as Grace pushed it with her foot. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called to its mate. "What about your family?" Grace asked eventually. "You've never mentioned them." A shadow passed over Yates's face. "Not much to tell. My father was a hard man who believed spare the rod, spoil the child. My mother died when I was 12. My brother was killed at Shiloh." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly, instinctively reaching for his hand. "That's a lot of loss for one man." Yates looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "Life goes on. You either move with it or get left behind." "Is that why you came west? To move on?" he nodded. "Partly. And partly because there was nothing left for me in Texas. The war changed everything. The land, the people. Me." Grace understood. The war had touched everyone, even here in California where no battles had been fought. Her own husband had been too young to fight, but his older brother had died serving the Union, leaving scars on their family that never fully healed. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. "No," Yates said firmly. "My future is here now." The way he looked at her when he said it made Grace wonder if he meant California or someone more specific. As the enforced rest period ended and Yates gradually returned to work, Grace found herself increasingly aware of the shifting nature of their relationship. There were moments when their hands would touch as they passed tools to each other, or their eyes would meet across the dinner table, and something unspoken would pass between them, something that made her heart race and her breath catch. Yet neither of them acknowledged it directly. They continued their daily routines, working side by side to improve the ranch, sharing meals and conversation, respecting the boundaries they had established months ago. But the boundaries were becoming blurrier with each passing day. One evening in late October, as they sat before the fireplace after dinner, Grace finally gathered the courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "We're nearly halfway through our year," she said, setting aside the ledger where she had been recording their expenses and income. Yates looked up from the bridle he was repairing. "So we are." "I've been thinking about what happens after," Grace continued, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of the ledger. "About your offer to sell the ranch back to me. Has something changed?" Yates asked carefully. "Do you want me to leave sooner?" "No," Grace said quickly, then moderated her tone. "No, that's not it at all. I've been wondering if there might be another arrangement we could consider." Yates set the bridle aside, giving her his full attention. "What did you have in mind?" Grace took a deep breath. "A more permanent partnership, one that doesn't end after a year." "You mean a business partnership?" Yates clarified, his expression unreadable. "Yes," Grace nodded, though a part of her wanted to suggest something more. "The ranch is doing better than it has in years. We work well together. It seems a shame to dissolve a successful partnership when the year is up." Yates was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. "And if I wanted more than a business partnership?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with possibilities. Grace felt her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "What exactly are you asking, Yates?" she said finally, needing him to be clear. He rose from his chair and moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "I'm asking if there's room in your heart for more than a business partner, Grace, because there's room in mine for more than a ranch co-owner." Grace looked down at their joined hands, her mind racing. I wasn't sure if I could care for you," Yates finished softly. "I've cared for you since the day I saw you standing alone in that courthouse, too proud to let them see you cry." "Why didn't you say anything?" Grace asked, meeting his gaze at last. "Because you needed time," he said simply. "Time to grieve Thomas, time to find your footing again. And because I wanted to earn your trust first, not rush you into something you might regret." The consideration behind his words touched Grace deeply. Thomas had been impulsive, sweeping her off her feet with grand gestures and passionate declarations. Yates's steady, patient approach was so different and, she realized, so much more suited to the woman she had become. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I find myself waking each morning thinking of ways to make you smile," Yates admitted, a vulnerability in his eyes she had never seen before. "I fall asleep at night in that barn loft wishing I was closer to you. And I dream of a future where this ranch is truly ours, not just mine on paper and yours in heart." Grace freed one hand to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you handed me back my wedding ring and whispered we rebuild together." The smile that broke across Yates's face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Does that mean you're open to a new arrangement?" "I think it does," Grace nodded, her own smile matching his. "Though there's still the matter of what people will say." "Let them talk," Yates said, echoing his words from their first day together. "As long as we know the truth of our hearts, their words can't touch us." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Grace met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with months of unspoken longing. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably mention that I've been saving to buy you a proper engagement ring." Grace laughed softly. "Always planning ahead, aren't you? When it matters," he nodded solemnly. And you, Grace Cooper, matter more than anything. Winter arrived with unusual force that year, bringing heavy rains that swelled the creek to flooding and turned the ranch roads to mud. Grace and Yates weathered the storms together, finding joy in the enforced closeness as outdoor work became impossible. They had decided to wait until spring for a formal wedding, partly out of respect for the traditional mourning period and partly because they wanted time to court properly. Yates moved his few possessions into the main house but maintained separate sleeping quarters, mindful of Grace's reputation despite their engagement. The town's reaction to their announcement had been mixed. Some, like Dr. Palmer, merely smiled knowingly. Others whispered that Grace had been too quick to replace her husband. But the majority seemed to accept that the arrangement made sense: a widow with ranch knowledge but no capital, and a bachelor with money but in need of a home. They'll always find something to gossip about, Yates reassured Grace after a particularly uncomfortable encounter at the general store. Next month, it will be the Hanson girl's scandalous new dress from San Francisco. Grace squeezed his hand gratefully. I know. It's just difficult sometimes, feeling judged for finding happiness again. Would you rather go back to being just business partners? Yates asked, though his smile indicated he already knew her answer. Not for all the cattle in California, Grace replied firmly. As Christmas approached, Grace found herself happier than she had been in years. The house was warm and full of life, with Yates carving wooden ornaments for their tree and Grace baking the recipes her mother had taught her long ago. They had invited the Richardsons and several other neighboring families for Christmas dinner, their first real entertainment as an engaged couple. The night before the gathering, a heavy snow began to fall, unusual for their part of California. By morning, the ranch was transformed into a winter wonderland, with drifts piling against the barn and fence posts, wearing caps of white. It's beautiful, Grace breathed, standing at the window in her dressing gown. I haven't seen snow like this since I was a girl in Oregon. Yates came to stand behind her, respecting the propriety of not touching her while she was in her nightclothes, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. Beautiful indeed, though it may mean some of our guests can't make it through the drifts. Then we'll have more leftovers, Grace shrugged, turning to face him with a mischievous smile. And more time to ourselves. Yates laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made Grace's heart flutter. I like the way you think, future Mrs. Dawson. The name sent a thrill through her. Soon she would be Grace Dawson, starting a new chapter of her life with this man who had appeared so unexpectedly and changed everything. As predicted, only the Richardsons and the recently widowed Mrs. Hollister from the adjacent property managed to brave the snow for Christmas dinner. The smaller gathering turned out to be a blessing, allowing for more intimate conversation and laughter around the fireplace afterward. You two make a handsome couple, Mrs. Hollister observed as Grace poured coffee. Reminds me of my Harold and me when we were first married. The way you move around each other, always aware, always in harmony. Grace exchanged a smile with Yates across the room. Thank you. We've had plenty of practice working together on the ranch. It shows, the older woman nodded approvingly. And it's good to see this house filled with happiness again. It deserves it after standing empty for so long. Empty, Grace frowned. But I've lived here since Thomas and I built it 12 years ago. Mrs. Hollister patted her hand sympathetically. Oh, I don't mean physically empty, dear, but a house knows when there's love in it. This one has been waiting for what you two have brought back to it. The observation lingered in Grace's mind long after their guests had departed. Had her marriage to Thomas been that obviously hollow toward the end? She had loved him, certainly, but looking back, She could see how they had drifted apart as his gambling took him to town more and more frequently. "Penny for your thoughts," Yates said as they washed the last of the dishes together. Grace passed him a plate to dry. "Mrs. Hollister said something strange about the house being empty before. It made me wonder if my marriage to Thomas was as transparent to others as it apparently was to her." Yates considered this as he carefully dried the delicate china. People see what they want to see generally, but those who have known real love can sometimes recognize its absence in others. "And its presence?" Grace asked, looking up at him. "That too," he smiled, setting down the dish to take her soapy hands in his. "Which is probably why Mrs. Hollister approves of us so heartily." Grace leaned forward to rest her head against his chest, unconcerned about the water dripping from her hands onto his shirt. "I do love you, Yates Dawson. More than I thought possible after Thomas died." "And I love you," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Enough to finish these dishes so you can rest your feet after standing all day cooking." Grace laughed and pushed him away playfully. "Such romance." "Just wait until you see your Christmas gift tomorrow," Yates winked. "Then judge my romantic capabilities." The next morning, Grace awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly and found Yates in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the same competence he brought to all tasks. "Merry Christmas," he greeted her, pulling out a chair at the table where he had placed a small, wrapped package. "Merry Christmas," Grace replied, eyeing the gift with curiosity. "What's this?" "Open it and see," Yates encouraged, setting a cup of coffee before her. Grace carefully unwrapped the paper to find a velvet box inside. Opening it, she gasped at the delicate gold ring nestled within a simple band set with a small but perfect diamond. "Yates," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "It's not much," he said, watching her anxiously. "But it's a proper engagement ring, like I promised." Grace extended her left hand where she still wore her wedding band from Thomas. "I should probably remove this first." Yates covered her hand with his. "Only if you're ready. There's no rush." His consideration brought tears to her eyes. "I am ready," she said firmly, sliding off the gold band that had represented a marriage that had ultimately brought her as much pain as joy. She placed it carefully in the velvet box, a part of her past that she would always honor but no longer needed to wear. "In that case," Yates said, taking the diamond ring and kneeling before her, "Grace Cooper, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife this spring?" "Yes," Grace nodded, tears spilling freely now. "With all my heart, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit as if it had been made for her. "Perfect," he murmured, rising to kiss her properly. "Wait," Grace said suddenly, pulling back. "I haven't given you your gift yet." She hurried to the small desk in the corner of the sitting room and retrieved a document she had hidden there. Returning to Yates, she handed it to him with slightly shaking hands. "What's this?" he asked, unfolding the paper. "The deed to the ranch," Grace explained. "I had lawyer Jenkins draw it up last week when I was in town. It lists both our names as equal owners." Yates stared at the document in surprise. "Grace, you didn't have to do this. The ranch is already half yours in my mind." "I wanted it to be official," she said simply. "We rebuild together, remember. That means equal partners in everything." Yates carefully refolded the deed and placed it on the table before drawing Grace into his arms. "Equal partners," he agreed, his voice husky with emotion. "In everything." Their kiss sealed the promise, sweet and certain as the future stretching before them. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the hills and new life in the pastures as the first calves of the season were born. The ranch was flourishing under their joint care, with new fencing enclosing the expanded grazing area and fruit tree saplings taking root along the creek. On a perfect April morning, with the apple blossoms drifting like snow and the air scented with promise. Grace Cooper became Grace Dawson in a simple ceremony beneath the old oak tree. Judge Wilson officiated, and nearly everyone from Ukiah and the surrounding ranches attended, curiosity about the unusual couple eventually having given way to genuine goodwill. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared, beaming at the couple before him. "Mr. Dawson, you may kiss your bride." Yates took Grace's face in his hands with a tenderness that made several of the women in attendance sigh audibly. "My wife," he whispered just for her, before claiming her lips in a kiss that spoke of all they had overcome and all they had to look forward to. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from tree branches. There was music from Old Man Peterson's fiddle, dancing on the patch of ground Yates had cleared specifically for the purpose, and more food than even the substantial gathering could consume. As the last guests departed, calling final congratulations and well wishes, Grace and Yates stood on their porch, truly theirs now, in every sense, and watched the moon rise over their land. "Happy, Mrs. Dawson?" Yates asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," Grace nodded, leaning into his embrace. "Though I must admit, I'm a little nervous about tonight." It was their first night as husband and wife, the first time they would share a bed after months of honorable restraint during their engagement. Yates tipped her chin up to look into her eyes. "We have all the time in the world. Nothing needs to happen that you're not ready for." His consideration only made Grace love him more. "I am ready," she assured him, "just a bit out of practice." The smile that spread across his face was equal parts tenderness and desire. "Then perhaps we should practice together," he suggested, sweeping her unexpectedly into his arms and carrying her across the threshold of their home. Later, as they lay wrapped in each other's arms, the moon casting silver light across the bed they now shared, Grace traced the scars on Yates's back with gentle fingers. "Does it bother you?" he asked quietly. "The evidence of what I've survived?" "No," Grace said truthfully. "These marks tell me you're strong, that you endured when others might have broken. They're part of what made you the man I love." Yates rolled to face her, his eyes serious in the dim light. "I want you to know something. When I bid on this ranch at the auction, I had no grand plan. I just couldn't bear to see you lose everything." "And now?" Grace asked, her hand resting over his heart. "Now I thank God every day for whatever impulse led me to that courthouse," Yates said fervently, "because it brought me to you, and you are everything I never knew I needed." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Grace reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Thomas's death and debts, the auction that should have been her lowest point, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who became so much more, all paths converging to lead her here, to this moment of perfect contentment. 5 years later, "Mama, Papa, look what I found." 6-year-old Thomas Dawson came running across the yard, his hands cupped carefully around some treasure. "What is it, son?" Yates asked, setting down the fence post he'd been preparing to secure. The boy opened his hands to reveal a tiny, speckled bird's egg. "It was on the ground under the big tree. Can we put it back?" "That's a quail egg," Grace explained, wiping her hands on her apron as she joined them from the garden. "And yes, we should try to find its nest if we can." "I'll show you where I found it," Thomas declared, turning to race back toward the oak tree before stopping suddenly. "Wait, I have to be careful with the egg," Yates chuckled, exchanging a fond look with Grace. "He's got your caution and my enthusiasm. Interesting combination." "The best of both of us," Grace agreed, watching as their son carefully made his way back to the tree, moving with exaggerated slowness to protect his find. Their second child, 2-year-old Sarah, was napping in the house under the watchful eye of Mrs. Peterson, who came to help 3 days a week now that the ranch had expanded to include not just cattle, but a thriving orchard and vegetable gardens that supplied produce to Ukiah and neighboring communities. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years since the auction," Yates remarked, putting his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together." "The best kind of marriage," Grace nodded, leaning into his embrace. "One that feels both new and eternal at the same time." They had faced challenges over the years: a drought that threatened their herd, a dispute over water rights with a new neighbor, the difficult birth of Sarah that had left Grace bedridden for weeks, but they had weathered each storm together, their partnership only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. "Pa, Ma, I found the nest," Thomas called from beneath the sprawling branches of the oak. "But it's too high for me to reach." "Coming, son," Yates called back, pressing a quick kiss to Grace's temple before heading toward the tree. Grace watched as her husband lifted their son onto his shoulders, guiding his small hands as he carefully returned the egg to its nest. The sight filled her heart with a joy so complete it nearly brought tears to her eyes. This was what happiness looked like, she realized. Not the absence of hardship or the fulfillment of grand dreams, but these small, perfect moments strung together like pearls on a necklace, each one precious in its own right, but gaining meaning from all that came before and all that would follow. "Grace," Yates called, breaking into her thoughts. "Come see what else Thomas found." As she walked toward her family, Grace thought of the words Yates had whispered to her on that fateful day in the Ukiah courthouse. "We rebuild together." They had done exactly that, rebuilding not just a ranch, but a life, a family, and a love that would endure long after they were gone, living on in the children they raised and the land they had nurtured back to prosperity. Under the spreading branches of the oak tree that had witnessed so much of their story, Grace joined her husband and son, ready for whatever new discovery awaited them together.